All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for Audubon's Western Water webinar. My name is Haley Paul, and I'm the Policy Manager for Audubon, Arizona. Audubon's Western Rivers Action Network is part of our Western Water Initiative, which is a multi-state effort to protect the Colorado River and the West network of saline lakes. Some 65,000 members strong and growing, we advocate for science-based, nonpartisan water policies and management that maintain river and groundwater levels, enhance the health of our environment, restore valuable habitat, and promote reliable water supplies for humans, birds, fish, and wildlife. At Audubon's Western Water team, we're working on a lot of Colorado River issues throughout the region. Today, Jennifer Pitt, Colorado River Program Director for Audubon, is going to share with us the latest on the Colorado River Delta and our binational cooperation with Mexico, especially on the environmental front. She'll bring big picture policy pieces like Minute 323 and the Drought Contingency Plan into focus and show how they interact with each other and how they impact the river, birds, and the habitat in the Colorado River Delta. You're all automatically muted, but there will be time for questions and answers, so make sure you type your questions into the chat box. This webinar will be recorded, and that link will be made available afterwards. Thank you again for joining us. We're really glad to have you, and with that, I will turn it over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Haley, and hello, folks, and thank you very much for joining. Got a good story to tell, I think, about binational collaboration to restore the Colorado River Delta. Maybe just the first thing to point out is that this story really is about the US-Mexico relationship in many ways. And that's why I've got the borderline flashing there. So I'll just jump right in. A quick overview of where I'm going to go today is to talk about what I call here the end of the Colorado River, and you can interpret that in a couple different ways. To talk about the US-Mexico negotiations and the minutes or binational treaty agreements that have come from those negotiations. To talk about the really exciting work restoring habitat in the Colorado River Delta. And then at the end, I will briefly touch on some unfinished business around the Cienega de Santa Clara, which is a large wetland in the Delta. So, the end of the Colorado River. And I want to start with a chart that surely some of you on this webinar have seen before. It was published by Reclamation in conjunction with their Colorado River Basin study back in 2012. And while the story about the Colorado River declining supply and the fact that the supply and demand lines have crossed, I think is pretty well known right now, at the time that the Bureau first published this chart, it seemed to wake a lot of people up to the fact that we have a problem on the Colorado River, where the use or the demand, the water demand exceeds the supply, and that jeopardizes a lot of communities that rely on Colorado River water, but it also jeopardizes the health of the river itself and the habitats that are part of that river ecosystem. The people who focus on water supply for communities really started waking up with that chart and with the declining state of supply in our reservoirs. And this here is Mead, taken years ago with that big white bathtub ring showing. But those of us who pay attention to the Colorado River Delta, way down at the downstream end of this enormous watershed, had known for decades that there was a problem. And we knew that because very little water has been flowing to the Colorado River Delta from the Colorado River. In fact, since the Glen Canyon Dam was closed in the early 60s, there are very few years in which water of any substantial volume has flowed down past the most downstream dam on the river, Morelos Dam. And I just want to pause and say, going back to my initial comment, that this is really a story about US-Mexico relations. You know, there's no, because of the border, there's no one government agency that had complete jurisdiction over the Colorado River Delta that has today. And that also means that there's no agency that felt it had a mandate to do anything about the fact that the Delta was drying out. I don't think there's any agency or even any person out there who deliberately thought about taking actions to dry out the Delta. That said, I think the way the governments are structured and the agencies are structured subnationally within those governments, no one agency could do anything about the fact that the Delta was drying out before our eyes over the last half century. And so as a result, here's a picture. I have a nice bit of repeat photography by a fellow named John Waterman. I don't know who took this first photograph, but John provided this to me. And this is a shot from the Colorado River Delta, presumably certainly before 1960. And here's a shot in that same location today, just showing a good indication of what most of the Colorado River looks like today, which is dry and a lot of scrub. A lot of that is salt cedar. And you even get to places where that desiccation is so complete and the remnant salts have made it impossible for pretty much anything to grow. But in the 90s, some folks from the University of Arizona, as well as from the conservation community, started talking about the fact that there really were some remnant habitats in the Delta, in pockets where water was still present on the landscape. And that's in ag drains, and maybe where ag drains are draining back into the river channel, and as well as in some places where the groundwater table is high. You could find these pockets of habitat, even some with native vegetation, in part because the river channel in that last 100 miles is so constrained and receives water so infrequently that when it does receive a river flow, that has in the past had some effect of channel disturbance. That is what creates that native habitat. And so, in fact, in the 90s, people were quantifying that the remnant habitat in the Delta that was native exceeded what you could find on the main stem of the Colorado River between Hoover Dam and the border. So it increasingly became an area of interest for the conservation community to see if some focus on water management and habitat restoration could do some good. And that is what led us into binational negotiations and the minutes. I want to start out by pointing out the obvious, which is that the Colorado River Basin is far away from the capitals of both the United States and Mexico, and that the diplomatic relationship between the two countries at the highest levels doesn't often recognize issues like Colorado River management, but nonetheless, the relationship at those highest levels tends to influence how decisions get made in a place like the Colorado River Basin. And it's because of that that we understand that the problems emerged in the Colorado River Delta. And so as the NGO, the conservation NGO community started to think about what could be done for this landscape, we knew that we had to start the conversation at a much more local level and bring together water managers from the Colorado River Basin with water managers from Mexicali and San Luis Rio, Colorado, and Sonora, Mexico, to have a conversation that was much more tied to the resource on the ground than you would if you went through the state departments of either country. And so that's where we started. And, just have to show you pictures of meetings. We started informal discussions back in 2007. The federal governments recognized those discussions by the end of the year in 2007. And so in 2008, there was government-led discussions that were initiated and carried on for years to try to build common understanding of the problems and the opportunities under the framework of a 1944 treaty that the US and Mexico share on the Colorado River. We went from meeting rooms to the field. We spent a lot of time on the ground trying to understand the irrigation district in Mexicali, to understand how it differs from irrigation districts in the US, to understand water law and policy in both countries, which is quite different. And of course, to look at habitats in the Colorado River Delta as well. I was fortunate to participate in many of those discussions. I won't say all of them. And people sometimes look at me and think, oh, that must have been a really sexy assignment to do diplomatic work, to do binational negotiations. And I'd like to point out that many of the meetings took place in this double-wide trailer, which is at the very southern end of San Diego County, sitting underneath the border wall and next to a binational water sewage treatment plant. So maybe not a high glamour assignment, but it was an opportunity not only to learn a lot about the issues, but also to build relationships with water managers and water users in Mexico, as well as in the US. But I think the community building that happened as a part of this process is as much a part of the success as the substantive agreements that came out of it. Where we got to first in 2012 was a first agreement called Minute 319, and that was given a 5-year shelf life, deliberately a short time frame. Interestingly, a 5-year agreement based on 5 years of negotiation. And the reason for the short time frame is that it was a lot of new things to try. And I think people who were leading the negotiations wisely saw that by biting off so much, we should come back to it in a few years to see what we liked and what we didn't like, to have an opportunity to adjust. And I think water managers in general are turning to agreements and adopting policy that has that kind of a sunset built into it as a way to make sure that our water management agreements are working for us over time. As the first agreement sunset at the end of 2017, we were extremely fortunate to see that the US and Mexico adopted a follow-on agreement called Minute 323, and that one is in effect through 2026, timed to expire at the same time as the interim guidelines that are governing Colorado River operations domestically in the US. The contents at a high level of these minutes include sharing shortages, I'll add sharing surpluses as well, giving Mexico access to reservoir storage in the US so that they can bank water. Minute 323 in particular, in addition to the platform of shortages that was first set up in Minute 319, Minute 323 has provisions for increased reductions in water use for Mexico to be triggered only in the event that the US adopts its Drought Contingency Plan. And by that, I mean the one in the lower basin, that is being hotly debated at the moment, particularly in Arizona. So those shortages are effectively to keep Mexico taking shortages proportionately to how the US is taking them. The minutes also provide for binational water conservation investments and exchanges of water. It sets up a number of venues to explore additional management improvements at the binational level. And then, of course, near and dear to my heart, it sets up binational commitments to restoration in the Colorado River Delta. So let's talk about what's going on in the Delta. The first agreement, Minute 319, adopted in late 2012, provided for what we called a pulse flow, more than 100,000 acre feet that would be released in a short time period to mimic pre-development spring floods on the river. It also set up base flows, about 50,000 acre feet, to support habitat over the duration of the minute. The two governments, the US and Mexico, provided the water for the pulse flow, and a coalition of NGOs provided the water for the base flows, operating through a private water trust today known as Restauremos El Colorado in the Mexicali Valley. Minute 319 also provided money for restoration, about $3 million, provided a US and Mexican federal government commitment to monitoring, which ended up yielding several $1 million worth of effort to monitor the hydrologic and ecological impacts of the work we were doing in the Delta. And the implementation was through the International Boundary and Water Commission, which is a commission of the State Department. And that commission set up a binational environmental work group that guides the work carried out by NGOs. So the restoration work itself is done by NGOs with contracts coming from the federal governments funded under the Minute. But we work in that environmental work group very closely with federal agencies, state agencies, and university representatives as well. So that context and that implementation with those stakeholder partners has been really part of the key to our success and keeping all those stakeholders apprised and engaged with how we implement restoration. So the pulse flow, I just have to point out this is a chart that shows the day of year, and the black line is showing you what a pre-development spring flood looked like. So that's the 1904 to 1913 median daily discharge at Yuma. And then down below, you see a little blue line that shows you what the pulse flow was in comparison. So I don't want anyone to have an illusion that we released a pre-development flood into the Delta with that pulse flow. It was a very little pulse, but because the Delta's landscape is so radically changed and developed at this point, we were looking at what kind of signal that pulse flow could send through the remnant river corridor. One of the keys is that, and this is a map on the left that shows the river in the Delta. At the very top right of that image on the left, you see the Colorado River at what's known as the northerly international boundary. It then travels downriver to the upper Gulf of California. And what we were looking at was a dry reach that extends for about 35 miles. Starting, I would add on the top right of the map again, where that arrow is pointing is actually Arizona. It's the very southwestern corner of Yuma County, where Arizona faces Baja California across the river. And the river goes dry there. And that's because from the last dam on the river, which is at that very northernmost point that you see, there's groundwater in the channel, but that groundwater table drops such that the channel is dry for that dry reach. And we were looking at the pulse flow, the opportunity to deliver a pulse flow, and thinking about the fact that a lot of the good habitat areas were downstream of the dry reach where the groundwater table is high again, and thinking about how could we get water in the channel all the way down to those good habitat areas. We spent the better part of a year working with an incredible team of scientists to design the pulse flow hydrograph, and then also with Reclamation and the International Boundary and Water Commission's Mexico sections operators to figure out operationally how to move that pulse flow through the Colorado River system. And you can see here, the blue line is what we requested, the red line is what we got, and that is pretty amazingly close for a river system as big and complex as the Colorado. At any rate, it was designed with a big pulse of, big volume of water in the first few days with a long tail to try to keep the channel wet and send the water as far downstream as possible. So a little bit about what that looks like. This is the very first water from that pulse flow spilling out of the gates at Morelos Dam, which is that final dam on the Colorado River. And that was on March 23rd, 2014. And the pulse flow did not arrive as a wall of water moving down the channel, but rather as a tongue of water creeping down the sand once it hit the dry reach. There's a picture from the air. And yet it crept and eventually did really fill the channel such that we had a river reappear in the Delta. And where that river reappeared, we really started to see results pretty immediately with wildlife back on the river where it hadn't been before. We saw that river flow down to sites that had been planted with trees so that we knew they were getting a drink. And notably, we saw people begin to interact with this river that hadn't been there before. I think for a lot of people who had perhaps seen the river in earlier stages of their life were pretty surprised and amazed to see it return. And then, of course, the kids who were there had never seen a river before in many cases. Even kids who are living in a city known as San Luis Rio Colorado, a city that's named after the Colorado River. This may have been their first chance to interact with anything like a river on their doorsteps. So the reappearance of the river during that pulse flow became a pretty big event for the community, and particularly in San Luis Rio, Colorado, which sits right on the dry river channel. The fact that there was a river back brought a lot of people down. Whenever we went down there, we saw people out enjoying it. It got picked up in the local newspaper. And in fact, a few weeks after the pulse flow started was Easter week, Semana Santa in Mexico. And that week was a major festival, fairly spontaneous, I would say. On the riverbanks, there were mariachi bands. You can see here even at some carnival rides. There were lots of picnics, taco stands. It really was perhaps the best example of a spontaneous river festival that certainly I've ever seen, perhaps anyone has ever seen. It was pretty spectacular. We also had the chance to see that pulse flow slowly but surely did make its way down to the upper Gulf. And here you see a picture that was taken in May. So some 2 months after the initial release of the pulse flow, where you see at the top of the photo, that's the pulse flow coming down across the landscape and heading towards the water you see at the bottom, which is a tidal arm. It's an area that floods with tidewaters from the upper Gulf. And I don't have the picture here, but the following day, those waters did connect. Now, I can't tell you that the relatively few molecules of water that mixed between the upper Gulf and the pulse flow had any ecologically meaningful outcome. I think the volume was just too small by the time the pulse flow reached down there. So much of it had infiltrated into that dry reach. However, the story that the Colorado had once again reached the sea really seemed to resonate with people. And that's one of those intangibles that we have to take away and see what we do with in the future as we think about environmental management with limited dollars and limited water resources. It's meaningful, and what do we do with that? So with the delivery of the pulse flow, there was the initiation of a really intense scientific monitoring effort. It was and still is a binational effort led by university researchers, but also including federal agency staff and NGO staff, and has produced a number of reports already. And we are actually expecting the publication of our final Minute 319 science report very soon. The report is effectively finished, but needs to be published by the International Boundary and Water Commission on their website, and there will be some press releases around it, so hopefully you will hear about it in the near future. Moving forward now then to Minute 323 and the environmental commitments, they are similar but different. The resources, again, come from the US and Mexican federal governments, as well as this coalition of NGOs. In this case, a third each of the following: water at 210,000 acre feet, which may increase to just shy of twice that volume if that kind of water can be conserved under the binational water conservation elements of the minute. $9 million for restoration, which I would say is seed money for restoration, but not enough to do everything that we'd like to do in terms of restoration work on the ground. And then $9 million for science and monitoring. One thing to note is that the water is made available, but no longer prescribed in terms of a pulse flow and a base flow. So with what we learned from that pulse flow, we learned that water in the channel does amazing good, but that perhaps delivering a pulse flow is not the most efficient or optimized way to put that water in the channel. So the water is effectively given to the environmental work group in a big bucket, figuratively, and the environmental work group has to figure out how to deliver that water to greatest effect. And we have been hard at work during this first year of implementation, trying to figure out what is that optimal way to deliver it. And again, we're working under the auspices of the International Boundary and Water Commission, US and Mexican sections, as a binational environmental work group, with work being carried out by the NGOs, federal agencies, and university researchers. So what does it look like? There's a lot of planning for these restoration sites, and in some cases, water is delivered to these sites through the channel, and in other cases, water is delivered to these sites through irrigation infrastructure. And here's a picture of a site called Chauce, built by Restauremos El Colorado, that has a big turnout from a nearby canal, and you can see here the flows being delivered into what's an old oxbow of the Colorado River in the Delta. And I actually have a picture from pretty much the same angle that shows you just after 1 year, if you look at the far bank, you can really see the growth of the vegetation, which can be quite spectacular in that hot sun, with trees growing many feet in a year. So that's the beginning of what restoration looks like. Of course, there's a lot of work that goes into preparing the land as well, removal of salt cedar, which is intensive labor. Another interesting part of the restoration effort is that all the plant material has to be grown on by the people implementing restoration. In the US, for big habitat restoration, programs, typically plant materials are sourced from commercial nurseries, but that plant material cannot be brought across the border because of phytosanitary laws. So, and there are no commercial nurseries growing native plants in the Mexicali region. So the NGOs that are doing restoration have set up nurseries on site to prepare plant material at scale. So plant materials developed, then they are out there planting them in the field. And as I said, it doesn't take very long for these sites to begin to look pretty spectacular with cottonwoods and willows, water flowing through, marshes. That hot sun helps all that plant material grow pretty quickly. And we're really seeing the emergence of some beautiful sites in the Colorado River Delta. We're also finding success in inviting communities locally into these sites, and imagining that most people on this webinar have good access to natural areas in the communities where you all live. I would say that in the Mexicali Valley, those opportunities are pretty limited. That landscape was so dramatically changed by the elimination of the Colorado River flows that areas like this, parkland areas with nature abounding in wildlife, really are few and far between. So this is a unique experience, and it's important for programming to reintroduce people to this kind of experience if they've grown up in a landscape without it. There's also active monitoring taking place at all of the restoration sites, as well as in transects along the river corridor outside of the restoration sites, so we can keep track of how we're moving the needle in terms of wildlife population and abundance at the restoration sites, and also how those restoration sites impact the rest of the corridor. And there is a bird banding program. And it's also been nice to see that couple people from the local community who work on the restoration crews have gotten good at bird ID and are now working as bird guides, birding guides, taking people through that area. So that's definitely an opportunity that had not been there for employment in the past. And we are hoping, as we see restoration scale up, that we see those kinds of opportunities scale up as well. So the sort of report out from the efforts of restoration under Minute 319 are as follows: more than 1,200 acres restored. We've seen increasing populations of wildlife, and we've reported more than 100 jobs created for folks in the local communities, more than 3,000 people a year currently being engaged in visits to these sites. And we have, as the NGOs, raised more than $13 million for restoration and water acquisition. And now, as we move into Minute 323, we're looking at scaling all of that up. We think of Minute 319 as our pilot, to our proof of concept that this is possible. And we're now really trying to figure out how we best scale this up and make it durable for the long term. So we are very much trying to incorporate lessons learned from all of the science and monitoring that was done during the first minute to optimize results for nature, for wildlife, but also for people. And that human dimensions aspect is a big one, and we're trying to make sure that it is a part of everything we do. And we're also developing a campaign to finance durable habitat and flows that connect the river to the sea. And when I say connect, I don't mean that we're going to have a river reestablished year-round in that last 100 miles, but rather that we're going to see some patches of habitat at, large, at the hundreds or even thousands of acres that are strung along this river corridor from the north, where you see it says Miguel Alemán, that's one restoration site, all the way down to the upper estuary. And we are going to use the water that's available to put flows into the Colorado River channel for brief periods, well, maybe 2 months at a time, or even 4 months at a time, keeping a portion of channel wet when it matters most, both to people and nature, but effectively to reestablish connectivity in some manner from that northern boundary between the US and Mexico all the way down to the Upper Gulf. It's a large collaboration. We have a lot of different institutions, and I'm sure I'm missing logos off this chart, but we have a lot of institutions that are cooperating to make this work possible. And the NGOs are working together in a coalition we call Raise the River. The NGOs at the heart of Raise the River are the Sonora Institute, Restauremos El Colorado, which is a local NGO that does restoration and also manages the Water Trust, Pro Natura Noroeste, the Nature Conservancy, the Redford Center, which is the family foundation center of the Robert Redford and his son Jamie, and they are helping us a lot with communications. And of course, the National Audubon Society. We are working together in Raise the River, and hopefully you'll hear from us some more soon as we, at some point early in 2019, launch our big new fundraising campaign to ensure that under the terms of Minute 323, we really maximize the restoration opportunity that binational agreement gives us. And I just wanted to sort of end my Colorado River restoration story with this image. It was actually created by the folks at the Redford Center, and it says, "Behold the mighty Colorado River. This river has thrived for 6 million years. It took 50 years to deplete it." And that looks a little depressing. It's the sad story of the Colorado River drying up in the sand, but it is not a picture of the Colorado River drying up in the sand. It's a picture of the pulse flow arriving in the community of San Luis Rio Colorado, and you can see all those people standing around the water anticipating and heralding its return. And I think there's something about this image that I find quite compelling, and that is that at this moment that we are really grappling with climate change impacts, over allocation and overdevelopment of the Colorado River supply, we are being forced, we, the global we being the Colorado River Basin, from Wyoming down to Mexico, all 40 million of us, being forced to grapple with how are we going to manage this resource into the future, because the current rules, the current law of the river is not adequate, certainly for ensuring that we have water to deliver to all those people who rely on Colorado River water supplies. And at this moment, while we are figuring out how to change the rules so that we can sustain these communities and these economies into the future, we also have an opportunity to address some of the environmental challenges on the river that have been impossible for the environmental community to get traction on in the past, in the context of endangered species law and river management law that really haven't been sufficient to address some of the worst things that have happened on the Colorado River. So I am an optimist that while it is definitely going to be hard to accommodate this declining Colorado River supply across our economies and communities, it really also does present us with an opportunity to improve the health of the Colorado River, certainly in the Delta, but hopefully far beyond. I told you I had a little unfinished business, and I guess I want to end with just a little bit more of what's something going on in the Delta. And that has to do with the Cienega de Santa Clara. So to orient you, the Cienega is a 40,000 acre wetland that sits in the footprint of the desiccated Delta. And so you can see that red border line again, separating the US from Mexico. And if you look, there's also a blue line that is a canal that is taking water out of the Welton Mohawk Irrigation and Drainage District, which is just basically where you see the town called Welton, to the east of that or to the right of that. So that area is being drained of its brackish drain water from their ag operations. And the brackish water is moving in this canal that terminates in the desiccated Delta, the once desiccated Delta, and has now formed this wetland that has been receiving water since the 1970s. And the reason that canal was built was to address concerns from Mexico about salinity of their deliveries, and the fix was to take that water out of their, the water that Mexico receives under the treaty that helps them irrigate the Mexicali Ag District, and to put it in that canal. So we have seen the emergence of the Cienega, and it really is in many ways the largest remnant habitat in the Delta at this point. And I recently had an opportunity to fly over it with Lighthawk, which is a organization of volunteer pilots that fly conservation missions. And this is what it looks like from the air. It is huge and quite spectacular, sitting in the middle of a very arid Sonoran desert landscape. So as you might imagine, it becomes a magnet for bird life. What's got me worried is that under the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan, there is a commitment to federal water conservation. And the language says the Secretary, that's the Secretary of Interior, will take affirmative actions to implement Lower Basin programs designed to create or conserve 100,000 acre feet per year or more of Colorado River system water. And we don't yet know what projects Interior or Reclamation plans to implement to secure that conserved water. And it's an interesting challenge because the federal government does not really have water rights. They might have a tiny volume of water rights for the wildlife refuges on the lower Colorado River, but certainly not 100,000 acre feet at all. And we certainly wouldn't want to see the water come out of water that's committed to wildlife refuges. So what we're worried about is that they may choose to operate something known as the Yuma desalting plant. It's a federally built desal plant that has been sitting in Yuma in ready reserve, not being operated for decades now. And it was designed to treat the water in that canal that is supplying the Cienega. And I would say if the Cienega was in the United States, we would not be having this conversation. But because that border between the United States and Mexico sits between the plant and the Cienega, it's an unknown. And Audubon will certainly be working and has already been working with Reclamation and Interior to make sure that this plant does not operate in any kind of way that harms the Cienega, either by depleting the water that's flowing to it or increasing the salinity of the water that is flowing to it. So there are other options, and we have been working on this, including federal dollars that can go to system conservation. In other words, payments to farmers for temporary and voluntary fallowing of their lands, reductions in their water use on a willing basis. If the federal government is paying for it, that water could count towards their commitment in the Drought Contingency Plan. There's also the potential to modernize infrastructure in the Yuma Valley in a way that separates the sweet water from the brackish water in their drainage that allows for increased delivery of Yuma drain water for the Mexico treaty obligation, and that we think that could count towards the DCP obligation as well. There's also the potential for binational reforms to the salinity standard that was adopted in the treaty in the 1970s that caused the canal to be built in the first place, but reforms there, not that harms Mexico in any way, but actually improves the reliability of Mexico's supply and could increase the available water quantity, thus allowing the US to release less water from Lake Mead for Mexico's treaty delivery, and again, conserving water, and that volume could count towards this commitment. And there's more. And I guess I wanted to take the time to explain a little bit of this because you all listening in are tied into Audubon's Western Water Initiative, and we may be communicating more with you about this in the next year, asking for your help to reinforce the importance of the Cienega and the importance of solutions to that federal water conservation commitment that leave the Cienega unharmed. It's important. The Cienega is home to a bird known as the Yuma Ridgway's rail. It's on the endangered species list, and 75% of that bird's population lives at the Cienega de Santa Clara. As I said, if the Cienega was in the United States, we would not be having this conversation. And I've been down there twice in the last month. That's good fortune for me. It is alive with bird life here with white-faced ibis. There are hundreds of thousands of shorebirds and waterbirds using this, particularly right now in the cold season, as their winter habitat. It is too important of a place for any harm to come to it. And so we may be asking you for help to protect it. So with that, I wanted to end my story. Thank you all very much for listening, for taking the time out of your day, and I am happy to answer questions if there are any.
Cool. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat box. I will start reading the ones off from the top and see if any more come in. So first one we have here asks, is this water, and I think that's in reference to the water in minute 323, is that water still dependent on a completed drought contingency plan?
Good question. The water for the environment in minute 323 is not contingent on a drought contingency plan. That was two contingents in one sentence, I'm sorry. The minimum commitment of 210,000 acre feet over the 9-year period is committed. And the opportunity to double or nearly double that volume really rests on whether the US and Mexico can identify additional water conservation projects that can be developed to create additional conserved water supplies, some of which would be made available for environmental flows. None of that is directly connected to the drought contingency plan. What the drought contingency plan will do in the minute is trigger Mexico's additional reductions to take shortage effectively on parallel to what the United States would be taking. I guess I'll pause to say the minute does also specify that the environmental flows are subject to shortages in proportion to all other water users in Mexico. So interestingly, Mexico does not have a priority system analogous to the one we have in the United States. So it's not that one water user would be shorted completely before others. So if the first level of shortage represents perhaps a 3 or 5% reduction to Mexico's overall water availability for a year, then we might see a 3 or 5% reduction to the environmental flow available. But the percentage reductions remain pretty small in the context of Mexico's overall allocation.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. The next one, I'm not sure if you want to take this or you might want to toss it back to Haley here at our office in Arizona. But what is your opinion on whether or not Arizona will be able to adopt and sign on to the DCP?
Well, I'll let Haley answer, but I'll just weigh in first and say that this is not so much my opinion as my great hope that Arizona will be able to adopt and sign on to the Lower Basin DCP. But Haley, do you want to take that?
Sure, I'll say a great hope as well. And we've been updating the network. We just wrote a blog on what's the latest. So my opinion and hope is that we're going to get it done. And the goal right now is people are still talking about the end of this year so that we could bring it to the Arizona legislature, who has to approve any deal in early 2019. And that session starts about mid-January for our 2019 Arizona legislature. So hopes and dreams of it getting accomplished, and there's a kind of a new implementation plan on the table that parties are working around and trying to just kind of iron out those final sticking points to make sure we can get a deal done. So that's what I would say about the update in DCP in Arizona, but we're watching it very closely and we'll keep you guys updated as well. And look out also for those, action times when it is time to hopefully, write into your legislators that it's time to support a deal. We're excited to hopefully be sending you that email.
A nice, simple answer. Yeah. Cool. Next up, since the Colorado River is over allocated, what water rights do the NGOs buy for environmental flows?
That's a really good question. So the NGO Water Trust sits in the Mexicali Valley. Mexicali Valley is about 700, I want to say it's, I'm going to get the acreage wrong. It's many thousands of acres of irrigated agriculture that is irrigated with Mexico's Colorado River allocation. And because they don't have a priority system like we do in a prior appropriation system, there is within that irrigation district a pretty active market for water, with farmers trading water rights between themselves, both on a permanent and temporary or lease basis. So the Water Trust was established in 2008, and with a little bit of seed money that was given by Foundation initially, started to acquire some water in that market, and then started to work with Mexico's National Water Agency, CONAGUA, to convert the use of that water in a legal and approved way from agriculture to environment within the geographic boundary of the Mexicali Irrigation District, which encompasses the entire region in which we're working on restoration. So it's really a reallocation or a market transfer of water from one user to another, from ag to the environment. And I will add that, right now the volume of water that the trust has is extremely small compared to the overall water availability for agriculture in that valley. Nonetheless, we are sensitive to any kind of perception that the trust is somehow diminishing agriculture in that region. And we are working closely with the management of the irrigation district and the subunits within that district to make sure they understand how the water is being used, and also within the context of the minute and those water conservation projects, looking for opportunities where the NGOs might be able to invest in some of the water conservation infrastructure that could also help farmers have a more reliable water supply, but also save water that could then be transferred to environmental uses.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, what do we got next? Does the Endangered Species Act help promote the restoration of flow into the Gulf? And I guess I'll add to that any analogous wildlife laws in Mexico that might apply?
I'd say what's helping is there are two things about the Endangered Species Act. One is there was litigation in 2002 called Defenders v. Norton that asked whether, that complains that the United States was not delivering adequate water into the Colorado River, into its delta to address the needs of endangered species in the delta. And the court found that the treaty really is the dominant piece of law, and that the treaty is not discretionary, and therefore that the United States cannot provide additional water. So therefore, and the Endangered Species Act effectively applies only to discretionary actions. But I will say, in terms of the Cienega and the canal that's taking water out of southern Arizona, agricultural drainage down to the Cienega, that is not the Colorado River and is not addressed under the treaty. And so I think there are questions about what would happen with endangered species litigation were it to be brought over the Cienega. However, I really hope we never see that litigation. We have built an incredible cooperative relationship over restoration in the Delta between the United States and Mexico. And I think that cooperation on the environmental work is actually yielding real benefits for water management as well, because for communities, because relationships have been built, and we have an investment in the relationship we've built between the two countries and between the people who are working on implementing this minute. I really would worry that litigation would destroy a lot of what has been built under the minute. That said, I also worry that operation of the Humid desalting plant would destroy the cooperation that has been built under that minute. So that is why Audubon is working so closely with Reclamation right now, trying to help them move in directions that leave the Cienega unharmed as they seek to conserve water in the future under the lower Colorado River Basin Drought Contingency Plan. And as far as Mexican law, I guess the one thing I can say is that there were reforms to Mexico's water law back in 2004 that, number one, recognized the value of water for the environment, water in rivers for the environment, and that was fundamental to being able to establish and operate the water trust. And generally, I'd say the dominant policy is the treaty, the minute that is part of the treaty, and that is what is driving water and effort to restoration in the Delta.
All right, thank you again. It looks like we're on our last question, unless anything else rolls in, and this one takes us a little bit away from the Delta and back up the river. Is there any appetite in the upper basin states to renegotiate the Colorado River Compact?
Well, I certainly won't try to answer for the upper basin. I'm sure nobody else in the upper basin wants me answering for them. I would say that my guess is that the compact is going to remain part of the law of the river, as long as I'm around to watch it. But, and there's a big but, I guess I see the approach that water managers and state political leaders are taking is, rather than scrap the foundational element, which is the compact, they're building new layers on top of it that move us forward into a management framework that works for all of us in the 21st century. And so I think it's entirely possible that over time we could see some things that we think about as the core of the compact being changed quite radically, but we won't see the compact itself disappear. We'll just see new agreements that are built on top of it that that fundamentally change how we are managing the Colorado River. And I think I see evidence of that already. I would say that in many of the agreements that are being crafted around these drought contingency plan negotiations, what we're effectively seeing is a turn away from prior appropriations through the use of markets. We are, I think collectively, I am seeing an acknowledgement that it does not make sense to take away all the water from a class of users, particularly when that class of users is a city with a large population dependent on that water, that we are finding ways to use transactions and water sharing agreements to compensate those who need to be compensated, but effectively to share the pain of the decreasing supply of Colorado River water. And none of these agreements can create new water. The Drought Contingency Plan doesn't create new water. A reformed compact, even if that was advisable, wouldn't create new water. What we're unfortunately stuck with is figuring out how to best manage a declining supply in this basin. But I think the good news is that as we add flexibility in those new layers of agreements, I remain optimistic that we're going to find out that we can do a lot with that diminished supply, and that our economies and our quality of life will be strong with the water supplies that we have, if we can keep working on this collaborative framework to try to modernize how we manage the Colorado River.
Cool. We've got one more that snuck in while you were answering, and I think I'll cut it off after that one because we're just about out of time. But you brought up campaigns to raise funds for this effort. Can you speak to what funds are needed for the most at this point?
Well, I can tell you in general, we need money to fund the sort of capital investment of that restoration work, where I showed you a lot of pictures of, the labor intensive efforts to get those trees in the ground. There's money that's needed to fund water acquisition for the private water trust. We already have a good corpus of water at the trust, but we'd like ideally to double that over the next decade. And then I think one of the things that we are grappling with is how do we make our efforts that are so magical when you see them, how do we make those durable? These areas are, not surprisingly, pretty intensively managed because of the landscape in which we are working and how radically changed it is. We have to manage water deliveries, and even those areas where trees are planted have to be tended, stewarded over time. So how do we pay for that? And when you think about the long term, you start thinking about the dollars as an endowment, and that can very quickly escalate the costs many folds times the way that we've been thinking about those previously. So I think all of those you will see reflected in sort of the justification or the components of the campaign that we launch hopefully sometime soon.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that, Jennifer, and to all of you for your really insightful questions. When we have this webinar posted, we'll be sure to let you know. You'll get an email. And thank you in advance for sharing that recorded webinar with others who were not able to make it today. So keep an eye out for updates and more webinars at audubon.org/westernwater. Thank you for your time and have a great rest of your day.